Thank you so much tonight for allowing me to be here. I greet you in the name of God, in the name of Jesus. As my Imam friend reminded us, we all say in the name of Allah. And I want to thank you for this moment to be in your presence. And if you would allow me just to pray as here tonight. Gracious and merciful and loving and kind God of justice, we thank you for making us all from one blood, filling us with one spirit. Guide us, O God, with your strength, your compassion, and your call for justice in this world. We commit ourselves to be your servants, and we ask it in thy name. Amen. Let me thank you tonight, your president, President Begg, and your son. I wish my son was here to meet him tonight. He just got arrested yesterday, my son, for protesting in North Carolina the cuts at our schools, in our UNC school system. To Imam Griggs, who has been a tremendous brother and friend. To Rob Stevens, one of my sons in the ministry, the way we say it in my faith tradition, who's here tonight, who's really kind of the cause of this connection between me and Imam Griggs and what's his name, John Mendez and all the good folk in Winston-Salem. I did want to say to you, Imam Griggs, that some criticisms are actually compliments. And so I know it's rough. I turn this mic up just a little bit if anybody has control of it. That the very fact that some of the people are questioning your chaplaincy is actually legitimizing your chaplaincy and your words and your work. I been wrestling with tonight, because words to me, as the Desert Father said, are very serious things. And you don't just say words, you don't just speak, you don't just talk. Because in my faith book, it says that words have the power of life or death. So I've been very prayerful about what I want to say tonight. And I want to talk for a moment with you about the necessity of moral dissent in moments like these. The necessity of moral dissent in moments like these. As a preacher, an humble servant of God, I always take root in scriptural text. I was glad to see that tonight as we began this time together. In the Holy Book that I read, both Old and New Testament, there is a scripture in Jeremiah that says this, and this is a more modern translation. God's orders, and this is talking to Jeremiah, talking to people who believe in doing what's right. Go to the royal palace and deliver this message and say to the leaders who sit on David's throne, to their officials, and to all of the people who have power. This is God's message. Attend to the matters of justice. Set things right between people. Rescue victims from their exploiters. And do not take advantage of the homeless, the orphans, or the widows, and stop murdering. Jeremiah 22. In the New Testament scripture that I read, Jesus is recorded as saying in his first sermon, not his second, third, last, but the very first sermon. In fact, in the scriptures that I read, Jesus was literally there was an attempted assassination on his life after he spoke these words. And it did not come at first from the larger political society. It came from his own people who had begun to believe the myths of domination. So when they heard the voice of liberation, they thought it was foreign and did not even know that it was the voice of God that had been spoken before in the prophets. And Jesus stood up and said this, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he hath anointed me to preach good news to the poor." And the word poor there in Greek is the word patokos, which means those who have been made poor by systems of exploitation. He sent me to announce and proclaim liberty to the prisoner, recovery of sight to the blind. And blind here means those who've been blinded, not just physically, but blinded by by injustice and hatred. He has called me to set the burden and the battered free. And he has called me to announce that this is God's year to act. That's Luke chapter 4. But I also read from your holy book in the Surah Nisa and found this passage. O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even as against yourselves or your parents or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor, for Allah can best protect both. Follow not the lust of your hearts, lest you swerve. And if you distort justice or decline to do justice, verily Allah is well acquainted with all that you do. Sound very much like my scriptures. When we are reminded that God sees in the light and in the dark. Each of these texts, the one from the Islam's holy book, the ones from Christians' holy book, the ones from the Jewish holy book, are all scriptures that talk about the prophetic task to engage in moral dissent in our world, to not just go along to get along. In fact, the prophets help us connect the dots between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. The prophets also emerged. When I was in seminary, my professor of Old Testament, as we studied the prophets, taught me that the prophets always arose when the priests and the kings weren't doing their jobs. It is the role of the prophet to dissent and to challenge the way. So that the prophet and the prophetic role and moral dissenting often happens when chaos and change are in the midst of the world. The task of the prophet is to simultaneously criticize and energize while working toward the formation of a new community. Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament scholar, says the prophet does not ask if the vision can be implemented, because the questions of implementation are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. So the role of the prophet is to infuse hope in the people, but it is a kind of prophetic hope. It is a hope that touches pain and despair and finds hope in the midst of that pain and despair, because it is the hope that is the refusal to accept the reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. This kind of hope is subversive because it limits the grandiose pretension of the present, daring to announce to the present, to which we have all sometimes made commitments, that their present is now being called into question. Now, this kind of prophetic hope can get you killed in America. You do understand you can get killed for simply saying, I have a dream, in the wrong place. You can say you have a dream for your children. Most people won't bother. You can say you have a dream for your wife, but dare to stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and dare to challenge hundreds and hundreds of years of racism and injustice, and dare to do it not with a gun, not with Molotov cocktails, but merely with the truth. And I have a dream can get you marked for destruction. But moral dissent is a necessity. Moral dissent is God's way through us of saying there's another way. There's a way better than hate. There's a way better than injustice. Moral dissent says there must be a contrast in the world. There must be a dissent to the ways of domination, destruction, and injustice. And moral dissent is not just the call of our holy books. It's not just something we ought to read about and celebrate what people did back then, like Jeremiah or the prophet Muhammad, peace be unto him, or Jesus, the Christ. Moral dissent is to live now. It's been in our history, and it's still our calling today. Let me show you what I mean. In America, we have this original sin called slavery that was based on color. It's America's original sin. Slavery based on color. And during slavery, a white abolitionist named William Lord Garrison was arrested because he was about to be lynched in Boston, not in Mississippi. He was about to be lynched in Boston as a white man because he dared to question the system of slavery. And a pro-slavery mob was going to lynch him in Boston, and the mayor of Boston threw him in jail to keep the mob from getting to him. And while incarcerated, William Lord Garrison wrote on the wall of his cell, William Lord Garrison was put into this cell Wednesday afternoon, October the 21st, 1835. 26 years before the beginning of the Civil War, to save him from the violence of a respectable and influential mob who sought to destroy him for preaching the abominable and dangerous doctrine that all men are created equal. That's 1835. But what was Lord Garrison doing? Engaging in moral dissent. And neither persecution nor the threat of death made him stop. And because of that, Lord Garrison was able to hook with people like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and beat the system of slavery. Henry David Thoreau wrote an essay called On Resistance to Civil Government. He's white now, white Christian, in the 1800s. And he said, when there is an unjust law, like the laws legalizing the institution of slavery, it is the duty of every just man to break that law. To break that law. A true patriot would not allow injustice. I wonder if Fox News could ever know anything about this. You know, Sean Hannity is always saying, you know, when people question America, question injustice, that's unpatriotic. Henry David Thoreau, one of the leading thinkers of our time, who was white, said it is the duty of every just man to break that law. A true patriot would not allow injustice to stand. That's moral dissent. So Thoreau's friend, another brilliant guy by the name of Ralph Waldo Emerson, visited Henry Thoreau in jail. And he said to Henry, Henry, what are you doing in jail? You're respectable. You're affluent. You know, I guess back in that day he lived on the middle upper class side of town, whatever that was. I don't even know if those economic terms were used back then, but you know, he was a pretty respectable guy like your president. What are you doing in jail, Henry? And Thoreau looked at his friend Ralph and said, with all of this injustice and all of this slavery, what are you doing out of jail? What are you doing out of jail? Moral dissent. Frederick Douglass once said this, moral dissent. He said, because I'm a Christian, and because I love justice, and I know the Jesus that loves justice and love and mercy and kindness, because I am a Christian, I must love true Christianity, but hate the hypocritical Christianity that attempts to use Christianity as a way of upholding the system of slavery. And I must call it something other than Christianity. Dr. King said 50 years ago, just before Selma, he was speaking in Los Angeles to a group of Jewish rabbis. And he says, there are some 40 to 50 million of our brothers and sisters who are in this country who are poverty stricken. I put a note there because you just said 48. This is 50 years ago. Dr. King was saying there are 40 to 50 million of our brothers and sisters in this country who are in poverty. They find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. But then he says this, certainly, America cannot be a great nation until we solve this problem. That's moral dissent. Recently, Keith Ellison, my good friend, Muslim cleric, Muslim who's in the United States Congress, representative, he made this statement, and this is a form of moral dissent. He says, listen, in America, the bottom line is we're not broke. We need to stop telling that lie. We are not broke. There's plenty of money. It's just the government doesn't have it. The government has it right. The government and the people of the United States have a right to run the programs of the United States, health, welfare, housing, all these things, and the people who benefit from being here have a duty and an obligation to support it. Now, when he says that, the so-called, I don't call them conservatives, the extremists say, but that's violation of capitalism, and that's not right. That's not the way of God. Well, Deuteronomy 14 says that you have a right, a responsibility to care for the poor, to lend to the poor. Jesus said that at the end of all things, we will be judged by this. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick, did you visit me? It always amazes me, these people who claim to be so Christian on all of these, so-called stations, and they're against health care. And if any of you know anything about Jesus, the one thing he did was he gave out free health care. I mean, that's all he did, went around healing people. One of your scholars said it like this: the choice is not between revelation and revolution, nor is the question whether should we get involved in politics or not, for all of us are already involved in politics. Even if you are apathetic and not concerned, you are involved in politics, because the apathy allows other things to progress. One of your scholars says, the question is not whether religion can be used for political purposes either. The question is which religion, that of the feudal lord or of the villager, or for those objectives, for the narrow class or capital's interest, or for God's family, for the people and their only home earth. That is the question. I believe, my friends, if you walk with me for a moment, that not only, though, is moral dissent something of history, not only is it something that we see a politician or a scholar engage in, I believe in this moment in history, I believe, and many believe, along with Imam Griggs and many others, that we are being called once again to recover the call of moral dissent. In fact, the truth is, in America has only had improvements, has only moved toward being a more perfect nation, has only fulfilled its promise of establishment justice a little bit better when we have had moral movements in this country of dissent. Check it out. Let me show you. And to understand this moral dissent and this need for moral movement, we have to learn from the freedom movement in history, since this is Black History Month. I don't know how many of you know this, but let me walk through this. Sometimes they say I sound more like a professor than a preacher, but I don't think that a preacher is emotional and a professor is intellectual. I think it all has to come together. Between 1865 and 1900, I don't know if you know this, down south, interracial alliances led by clergy, moral leadership, in every southern state, I want you to 1865, clergy, black and white, in this South, rose up to push for things like public education, protecting the right to vote, curbing corporate power, fair tax policies, and even new labor policies. in 1865 in America, black and white clergy were working together down south and transforming this nation. In 1865, less than a year after the end of the Civil War. And for the next 30-some years, down south. In fact, almost every Southern legislature between that period of time was run or guided by a majority black legislature. We're not told that. We had a black senator from the South before 1875. His name was Hiram Revels. In the South, down south. But the radical and racist Dixiecrats of this period could not stand it. And near and around 1870, 5 years after what we call Reconstruction began to happen in America, they started an immoral campaign. Now I want you to hear the line. I'm talking about 1800, but you will see how it sounds eerily like today. They started a campaign to redeem America, to take America back to a place where certain folk rule, and to redeem it from the influence of black and white people making progress. They could not stand raising taxes for public education. They could not stand the diversity. So they attacked it with the divisive rhetoric of white solidarity. They launched a frontal attack. The first thing they did was they formed the Klan, a terrorist organization, in 1872 to terrorize not at first black people, but white people who were working with black people. They worked to take over the courts. They worked to deny the vote through intimidation and violence. They were driven by fear. They said, we have to stop this fusion movement. In fact, I was telling Iman Griggs that in North Carolina, in May 12, 1896, a guy by the name of Charles B. Aycock, who later was awarded the governorship for his role in creating blackophobia. I mean, or Negrophobia. He was a very good orator. He was very smooth, and he knew how to incite white men. So on May 12, 1896, not far from where I pastor, he gathered 1,000 white men in a field. And he began to tell them that if they did not take over the government, if they did not stop all of these black people from being involved, if they did not stop these black men and white men from working together, their women would be under attack and raped, and their communities would be terrorized. Now, I'm talking 1800, but you're hearing some of that now, aren't you? Huh? Because what we know from history is that every time America makes strides and there's a coming together and there's adversity, there's this reaction. Every time there's reconstruction, there's this immoral deconstruction. And so they continued. They began to cut taxes so that the government could not perform its jobs in helping the least of these. They began to incite riots from New Orleans to Wilmington to Atlanta to Springfield. And by 1896, they got the Supreme Court to rule on a case called Plessy versus Ferguson that says separate but equal was constitutional. And by 1900, all of the progress from 1865 to 1890 was done away with. The last black congressperson. Now think about this. You had majority black legislators all through the South. You had black people serving the United States Congress prior to 1870, 1872. But by the end of the 1800s, that was over, and the last black congressperson was run out of the United States Congress, and North Carolina did not get another black congressperson until 1990, 90 years later. And they concluded all of this deconstruction by making a movie that glorified the terrorism of the KKK and lifted up the KKK as a Christian organization that saved the soul of America. Now, you get to the second Reconstruction. Just walk with me a second. Second Reconstruction starts around, we say, 1954, with the passing of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Then you get the murder of Emmett Till in 1955. Then his mother does something that is a form of moral dissent. She refuses to close the casket of her son. She makes America look at what terrorism and racist terrorism will do. And she makes them look at her son and his mutilated body. Rosa Parks sees his body and is so moved by that, and then later on is moved because his killers are acquitted, that she then decides to sit down and challenge the system of Jim Crow on December 1st, 1955. And that gives a platform for Dr. King to stand up, and that begins, if you will, the second Reconstruction. And during that period of time, black and whites come together. You see a coming together, cross-racial, cross-class solidarity. You see Chicano workers, Jewish students, Native American sisters and brothers, Malcolm's X Challenge, the Poor People's Campaign. All of these movements find a place of moral dissent and begins to push America. And in this context, from 1954 to 1968, you see things like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You see changes in Social Security. You see the Civil Rights Act of 64. This is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In fact, what actually helped get us the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was when on March the 15th, to commemorate the death of a white Unitarian preacher and a black young man who had just come back from service who was killed in Selma, Dr. King sends a telegram out and says, all religious leaders, come. Now, history doesn't record, but I know there were some Muslims there. It doesn't record it. The pictures you see are mostly Christians and Jewish, but there were some Muslims there. They responded to that call. And so in Selma, you had this gathering of religious leaders from every faith coming together. And the power of that moral dissent gave what Lyndon Baines Johnson would later call the greatest piece of legislation, bigger than any victory on a battlefield that America has ever won, called the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But Lyndon Baines Johnson didn't just sign it. He didn't want to sign it. He signed it because of moral dissent, because preachers and leaders came together. What happened, though? Around 1965, 66, the same extremism said, we can't have this. Too much working together, too much progress. So what do? They start the same things that happened in the 1800s. You see terrorism. They killed 4 little girls, 1963. In Birmingham. They killed Medgar Evers. They killed Jimmy Lee Jackson. They killed a white woman named Viola Wooster. They killed Malcolm. Later on, they killed Martin. They killed a president. They killed Robert Kennedy. Killing. To stop this progress. And then they decide we've got to do something else, though. And they come up with a philosophy called the White Southern Strategy that will be used in the South, but it will also be used in the suburbs of the North. And what did this strategist say? Well, I just decided I would just read to you what one of the architects said. This is not my word. He says, listen, we found out this is how we could control America. He said, this is Lee Atwater. You can go on Google and get it. He says, you start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. But by 1968, you can't say nigger because that'll backfire you. So you start saying things like force busing and states' rights. You're getting abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes and law and order. You say these things, and they sound economic. They sound like they're benign. But the byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites, and you are able to sow fear in a way to divide America. And it worked. And the champion of this strategy ended up being Ronald Reagan in 1980. Because in 1980, he opens his presidential campaign in Money, Mississippi, where Swanner, Cheney, and Goodman were killed, and he uses all the language of division in order to sell his case, particularly in the South, and he wins a landslide. Now, you say, Rabbi, why are you going through this first Reconstruction, second Reconstruction? Why are you talking to us as Muslims about this? Because if you understand these first two Reconstructions, the goals, moral goals, and then what turned back the Reconstruction, what deconstructed the Reconstruction, you'll understand some of what's happening in America right now. Why? Because in 2008, you have a guy named Barack Hussein Obama. That's a strange name for an American president. Huh? He runs for the presidency. And guess what he does? He says, I'm going to run a campaign rooted in fusion politics, like in the 1800s, like in the 1960s. He wins, and he wins in places like North Carolina and the South Carolina. And how does he win? His electorate, I'm not talking about him, but the electorate is young, is old, is broad, is deep, is black, is brown, is Hispanic, is Asian, is Christian, is Jewish, is Muslim. It's people who want to push America beyond the vestige of racism. His election represents in America the possibility of a third Reconstruction, and it might just work. The demographics are changing. More black and brown people and younger people are not so bound as they once were. But the problem with that is that that electorate scared the daylights out of those who have a homogeneous view of life. His name scared them. The electorate scared them. He got to be something other than, there's something wrong. You're not supposed to have a black man from Kansas hook up with a black man from Kenya hook up with a white woman from Kansas, and they not end up as the Wizard of Oz, but instead they end up producing the president of these United States. And what do you see? In the first Reconstruction, it took about 30 years to deconstruction. In the second Reconstruction, it took 14 years to deconstruct it. But when this electorate changes the course of American history, and a man of African American and mixed descent is now in the White House built by slaves, they do not wait 30 years or 14 years, but immediately the system of deconstructing that, and the first tool of deconstruction this time is to other the president, to say he's something other than an American, got to be a Muslim. And then they began to rev up this anti-Muslim rhetoric, even though he's a Christian. But that doesn't matter, because I think in America we have the First Amendment that says there is no religious test in America, except when some folk want to divide us. And what do? They go after voting rights, they go after labor rights, they go after immigrant rights, they go after fair tax policy, and they produce fear based on race and religion. I bring this up, my friends, because I believe, this is where I wanted to get, that we are in a moral struggle for the heart and soul of America. We are in the embryonic stages of a third Reconstruction. And that's why you see all of these attacks happening at the same time. The attack on Muslims, the attack on voting rights, the attack on women, the attack on the poor. All of these are attacked because if all of the people who are being attacked get together and stay together, we can begin to fulfill more of the promises of America. You see, the word heart comes from the Latin word cor. So in its original meaning, it means the center place of where all of our knowings converge. But the heart, the word heart, cor, is also the Latin root for the word courage. That's why it is proper when you says he has heart or she has heart. It means they have courage. And so what's being threatened now is the heart and soul of this country, our very deepest moral and constitutional belief. And somebody must have the heart, the courage to raise the moral dissent against the extremism that wants to keep us divided. How do I know we have a moral problem? When money and greed and political hubris and ego and beating your opponent becomes more important than working to uplift humanity, we got a moral problem. When we underfund public education and we create anorexic, high poverty, resegregated school, and anorexic teacher salaries, and then we have anorexic student performances, we have a heart problem. When we see extremist politicians who will cut taxes for the wealthy and raise taxes on the poor and working poor and refuse to give living wages and decent minimum wages and will refuse collective bargaining and labor, we have a hard problem. When we have in the South, we have states in the South where 20% of the population are living in poverty, black and white. Where in my state, North Carolina, 1.7 million people live in poverty, 700,000 children, 40% of them are black children in the South. And yet we have more politicians in the South against programs to help the poor than we do politicians who are concerned about the poor. We have a moral problem. When politicians who get free health care because they get elected don't want other people to have health care once that have elected them, we have a moral problem. When we have black unarmed men shot down in the street and more attempt is made to prove how it was their fault, how just walking around somehow unarmed is your fault when you get shot, when you have your hands up, when we have put more attention trying to prove it was their fault, or that somehow black men are born suspect or predisposed to some kind of animalistic behavior that means you got to shoot first and ask questions later, we have a moral problem. When we live in a country that sings God's grace, about God's grace being shed on us, but we find ourselves having to battle against those who want to deny grace and equal protection to the immigrant community, to people regardless of their sexuality, when they want to deny women's rights, we have a moral crisis. When 50 years after Selma and after Bloody Sunday, we find this nation in a fight to preserve voting rights. Can you imagine that? A country that calls itself a democracy, and yet you have politicians elected by the vote who are trying to keep people from voting. It's almost a form of social insanity. We have a moral crisis. And when, my friends, we can trace, and I did a little thinking about this in mind, when we can trace, the PBS did a study that said the earliest Muslims came from a certain region of Africa in the early 14th century. We can trace that. Believe they were Moors expelled from Spain who made their way to the Caribbean, possibly to the Gulf of Mexico, coming to North America. When we can trace that Columbus made his journey to the United States and took with him a book written by Portuguese Muslims who had navigated their way to the so-called New World in the 12th century. When we can trace that there was a Muslim, a notable man, Istanfan, who accompanied the Spanish as a guide to the New World in the early 16th century. When we can trace that between 1878 and 1924, Muslim immigrants from the Middle East, particularly from Syria and Lebanon, arrived in large numbers and settled in Ohio and Michigan. When we can trace that 10 to 15% of the slaves were Muslim, when we can trace that one of the first big employers of Muslims was the Ford Motor Company, because the Muslims were often the only people willing to work in the hot, difficult conditions of the factories. When we can trace that during the 1930s and 40s, Arab immigrants began to establish communities and build mosques. When we can trace that African-American Muslims had already built their own mosques, and by 1952 there were more than 1,000 in North America. When we can trace that after 30 years of excluding most immigrants, the United States flung open its doors in 1952, and an entirely new group of Muslims came from places such as Palestine and Iraq and Egypt. And then in the 1960s, waves of Southeast Asian Muslims also made their way to America, and Muslims came from Africa, Asia, and even Latin America. And when we can trace and know that the American Muslim Council claims 5 million, another center says 3 million, but we know that there are between 4 and 7 Muslims in America, and that Islam is expected to soon be the second largest religion in America. When we can trace that, and then in the midst of still knowing that, we can also trace and track that after 9/11, the vicious attacks on American Muslims and people who appeared to be Arab skyrocketed. When we can trace that, we talk about 911 in this country, but you know the most vicious per capita death of Americans in this society occurred on November 10th, 1898, when 2 to 3, some say 4% of the entire city of Wilmington, North Carolina were killed by terrorists. When white terrorists brought a Gatling gun into Wilmington and shot people down in the street, when ministers stood in their pulpit the Sunday before that Tuesday and declared that it was the will of God to return the government to the right ownership of the white man, even if it meant filling up the river with the blood of the Negro. When we understand that we have seen significant attacks since 9/11 on Latinos and non-European looking people, and that many of our white sisters and brothers are trained to think in black and white, have never been able to differentiate in the way that they see people. When we've seen the green light of a group of neoconservatives who've been advocating for stronger U.S. military presence in the heart of the greater Middle East, when we see the drums since 9/11 of war get louder and louder, when we see few people in the Congress or the media daring to challenge this drumbeat, we have a moral crisis. When we hear about lists, secret lists, no-fly lists, terrorist lists, and we know the history of lists in this country, like the red list for communists, or the list that black people had to deal with when they had to deal with being on the white Sovereign Commission's list in Mississippi and Alabama. That is when the Sovereign Commission would put your name and your picture and your address, if you were black, in the paper, to be sure that the Klan and others knew where you were. We've been down this road before. When we see the faith of Islam being castigated again and again for political reasons. Think about it. We never made the claim that the KKK was Christian. Not openly. I mean, some people did. No former person would ever say that the KKK was Christian. Or that Jim Crow was Christian, even though Jim Crow hijacked certain phrases from Christianity. The KKK hijacked certain symbols from Christianity. We don't even say, many people don't even say Franklin Graham is mainstream Christianity. Because of the way in which he's so hurtful in his description, particularly of Muslims. And yet, people want to say ISIS is Muslim, rather than a terrorist organization that is misused. You see, there's a hypocrisy here. There's a hypocrisy here. None of these extremists would stand up and say that the KKK that actually uses the cross and fire, they wouldn't say that those are the KKK are radical Christians. It wouldn't. It just wouldn't. But what's going on here with this Islamophobia? When we see the public prayers of students being vigorously attacked, you remember that? Duke University said we're going to let Muslims pray. Franklin Graham gets on the phone, calls people, all of a sudden they back off. Prayer! And the hypocrisy of that is, and I went to Duke, and I said when I spoke to them, I said, wait a minute, so you're going to back up. So Franklin Graham has something to say about Muslim students praying, and nothing to say about Robert E. Lee being carved out as an icon on the front of the chapel. Robert E. Lee, that's right. Robert E. Lee, yes, sir. That's why I'm teaching this stuff today. I'm taking a little long, but let me do what I'm doing. This is the stuff we don't talk about. That Duke Chapel was built and designed by an African American who Mr. Duke said, don't tell anybody that you're the designer. And it was years before that truth was known. In fact, there is some lore, some say it's true, some say that Mr. Duke and some of them are buried underneath the chapel, and one of the things they said that if a black person ever stood in the pulpit, they would get up out and turn over in their grave. So when I preached in the pulpit, we can't talk about part of our history. when we see hate and violence elevated and perpetrated on 3 college Muslim students, God rest their souls. And there is a debate about, did hate do this? And we know, we don't have to guess this, if the killer had been thought to be Muslim and the young children were 3 white co-eds, or could have even been just 3 African-American co-eds, there would have been cries of terrorism, cries that ISIS has now come to our shore, and they would have shut down the airports and turned over there would have been an automatic federal investigation. Everything from every part of his computers and whatever tools of communication would have been examined. We know this. We have a moral problem. And that is why, my friends, we must have a moral movement, as I make my conclusion. But in this moral movement this time, Imam, we have got to do something. And I put some of this on me as a Christian minister. I want to say something to you as Muslims and me as a Christian minister. We as Christians have to update the call of Dr. King. Dr. King at the March on Washington concluded, he said, the day will come when black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, we must say, and Muslims, we must say, I must say, as a Christian pastor, that it cannot merely be Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics. But until Jews and Christians, Protestants and Catholics and Gentiles and Muslims can say free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last, then we're still not the nation. But then one of my dear friends, Sister Khalid, she wrote to me, knowing I was coming here, you saw her on the tape, and she said, but Reverend Barber, we too must say something. She said, as believers, this is what she wrote to me. She said, as believers in one God, we know that human reason is itself God's gift, and that it soars to the highest plane when suffused with the strength of brotherhood. In fact, when human reason allows itself to be united with faith, it is far from weakened. Rather, it is strengthened to resist prejudice and discrimination and able to reach beyond the limitations of division. Together, we have the power to make this change. We live in a society, she said, plagued by poverty, racism, educational inequality. Our Constitution says all men are created equal, but they are not treated equal. Then she said, this is the time to remember the example set by the Prophet Muhammad. And she wrote this to me as a Muslim. When he allied himself with Abyssinian Christian king Negus. Abyssinian, that's African, isn't it? In the 5th year of Islam, she said, the Muslims were forced to migrate from Mecca, away from the violence and persecution they suffered. During this time, Islam found its first refuge in a Christian land, under the protection of a Christian king who viewed Muslims as his brother and sister. So I ask you, she said, and she said, talking to Muslims as well, consider the context. To be a disciple of Muhammad, she said, one must also be a historian. Arguments over complicated theologies about the nature of Jesus was not what mattered to Negus as a Christian. What mattered was that God had sent Jesus to teach humanity to love and justice. And Muhammad was sent to follow the teachings of Jesus. This is what she says. This itself created a bond between Christians and Muslims that was followed by a combined effort to establish social justice and human rights. She says, I believe that the relationship between the Christian king and the Muslim refugees is not just a memory of time long past. It is, I hope, a vision of a world still to come, a world that will be built by sincere people of faith when Christians and Muslims come together for reconstruction and rebuilding what Muhammad and King Negus built together more than 1,400 years ago. A movement where Christians and Muslims join together that calls for compassion, equality, sustained liberty, and justice for all. If they did it 1,400 years ago. And so we must develop a new interfaith century. You know, Christians came together in the 1900s and developed a little magazine called The Christian Century. I think we ought to update that. We need an interfaith century. where we can all come together. And we need a movement that will stand against hate and fear and injustice and violence. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it when a leading activist in Ferguson is Palestinian. And Ebony magazine has a large piece on the delegation to Palestine of Ferguson activists. And when you have young African Americans going to Palestine and looking at the comparisons and parallels between that occupation. We are seeing it when people are starting to make clear that Islamophobia in the U.S. is a branch of the sin and the system of racism, and we must call it what it is. We are seeing it when people are starting to understand that for the U.S. warmongering class, this is why they fear diversity in the electorate, why they scapegoat people of color abroad, because when more people come into the electorate, the scapegoating of people of color abroad becomes harder. The more black and brown and progressive white and young people vote, the more people vote who understand true Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the more we talk about compassion and justice, and the more the electorate grows at home, the more anti-war the electorate becomes at home. This is the root of why they try to identify ISIS with Islam, rather than call them terrorists. Because it is only by doing that that those who are warmongering can continue to monger their war. What do we need? I believe we need a moral movement that has 5 pieces to it. 1, economic sustainability and ending poverty and unjust war. We ought to be able to agree on that, Christian, Muslims, across the. We ought to be able to agree on educational equality for every child. We ought to be able to agree on health care for everybody. We ought to be able to agree on fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities as it relates to black, brown, and poor white people. And we ought to all be able to agree out of our different places of faith that equal protection under the law is not just a constitutional right, but it is a human right that comes from God. We ought to be able to agree on that. And so somebody must say, Mr. President, it doesn't matter what party is in power. It doesn't matter who has a political supermajority. It doesn't matter how much money you spend on Fox News. It doesn't matter how much money the Koch brothers spend. There are some things that transcend political majorities and mere majority politics. There are some things that are bigger than liberal versus conservative and right versus. There are some things that are right and there are some things that are wrong. And the better way, the moral way says we can reject hate and division and mean attempts to right people out of their constitutional protection and their humanity. We can respect the dignity of all people. We can love all people. We can see all people as God's creation. We can, as a nation of immigrants, welcome immigrants rather than abuse them and arrest them and abandon them and racially profile them. In this moment, the very destiny of our society is at stake. And the question is, do we want a wholesome society? Do we believe that justice is better than injustice, love is better than hate, hope is better than despair, community is better than division, peace is better than war? Do we believe that? And if we do, we must be willing, Muslim and Christian together, to stand up and raise our moral dissent. And we can't turn back now. We need these kinds of movement. That's what we're trying to do in the Moral Monday movement. Down in the state, 1,000 people have been arrested. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, people who don't believe or struggling with their belief, black, brown, white, young, old, people of all different faiths, different sexualities, people of different backgrounds. But we've come together not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as the moral agents of our time. As those who must go down to the places of power and demand that we do what is right by all the people. And we know the power of standing together. In my holy book, it tells me that when Moses and Aaron and his rod got together, the prophet Moses, and stood up against Pharaoh, the sea opened. And the people came out of bondage into liberation. My book tells me that when David got together with his slingshot out on a battle, there was this guy named Goliath. He was, I say, 9 feet tall, they say. But when David got together with his slingshot and God got together with David and his slingshot, the next morning in the headline of the paper, it said, the bigger they come, the harder they fall. My Bible tells me there were these 3 boys named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when they got together and they stood against what was wrong, wasn't but 3 of them, there was a whole army against them. But when they stood together, and even though they got thrown in the fire, Imam Griggs, and even though they got criticized, when the fire cleared, even the king who had criticized them had to bow to their God, had to bow. I know from my holy book the power of coming together. But I also know the power of coming together in a moral way when I look back through the history of civil rights. You know, during slavery, it looked like it was lost. It looked like we were just, there's nothing you could do. But when Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Quakers and evangelicals and people like Thoreau and others got together and they formed a movement, they were able to beat back slavery. When women got together, like Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Canton Staton, they were able to win voting rights for women. When Thurgood Marshall got together with Jewish lawyers and white lawyers and black lawyers, when Thurgood Marshall went before the Supreme Court in 1954, do you know there were all white justices and one of them was a member of the Ku Klux Klan that sat on that bench? No. And the Chief Justice Warren, nobody expected him to do this because he had been so racist toward Chinese immigrants out in California. Nobody thought that this court would be the one that would turn Plessy versus Ferguson on his head. But Thurgood Marshall, Jewish and white lawyers got together and they dared to go in there, not just with the law of man, but with the moral law of God. And they won. And they won. And when Rosa Parks sat down and Martin Luther King stood up and Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and others pulled together people and with Abraham Herschel and Viola Luisu and others that are unnamed, and all of that moral energy came together in this country, we were able to beat the back of Jim Crow. So I know when we come together biblically, we can change things. We come together historically, we can change things. But I want to close here by letting you know, in 2003, an ambulance came to my house as I woke up one morning and could not walk at all. Drove me to Durham Regional Hospital, where I would spend the next 3 months. The doctors looked, they scanned, they found out that I had an incredibly aggressive arthritic disease. And there was the possibility that I might never get up again at 30. For me, it was the most traumatic time of my life because my legs, I was a football player, had always been my strength. I was diagnosed with a disease called ankylosing spondylitis, an extreme form of arthritis that fuses your bones, literally fuses your vertebrae and bones and hips and locks them into place. And I had had a strange attack. My neck, base of my spine, my hips all had hit at one time, and there was no real cure for it. None of the medicines seemed to touch it, even though one time I was on Demerol and literally almost 1,000 milligrams of a drug called naproxen that literally can eat at the very lining of your stomach. I had some periods of time of depression. I had to come to grips with the fact that everybody, that every person God ever called to be his servant, his prophet, had some challenge. I don't know enough to talk about Prophet Muhammad's challenges that also let you know that he was God, was a person of God, because despite the challenge, but I know Isaiah was described as a suffering servant. I know Moses couldn't talk. He stuttered. I know that Paul the apostle had a thorn in his flesh. I know that Paul said, when I'm weak, that's when God is strong. But I almost gave up. Sometimes like we feel like almost giving up in the face of all this racism, islamophobia, and hatred. Why do you get death threats for just wanting to help poor people? I've been there. And I almost gave up on that bed, and then something happened. Somehow or another, I began to fight my way back. somehow or another God's Spirit visited me. People prayed for me of all different faiths. And then something happened. My doctors got together. And my nutritionist got together. My mother, who's a Pentecostal, came up and she played the piano and got the rhythms together. The deacons in my church got together. Friends got together. My swim coach got together. My family began to pray together. And we learned in that moment that no matter what you're facing, when we all get together, transformation can happen. And so tonight, I can stand up here for nearly an hour with no walker. Not because of me individually, but because somehow God brought us together in a moment of crisis to fight back. And could it be that there is the crippling effect in America right now, but that crippling effect and the disease of hatred and racism is trying to stop us, but we have been called together for such a time as this? Could it be that the Spirit of God is saying we are not allowed to enter into a depressive silence? We are not allowed to just let wrong and injustice have absolute control of the mic. We're not allowed to just let the powers do what they want to do without naming the powers and calling the power and seeking to redeem the power. We're not allowed to just let the extremists on Fox News have the last word. We're not allowed to stand down and retreat. We're not allowed to get in our Muslim corner and our Christian corner and our Jewish corner. We're not allowed to do that anymore. Howard Thurman once said in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, where do you stand? Who do you speak for? Is the question all of us must answer in every age. And so I believe we must say in this moment, I don't know how to fix it all, but I know we will only fix it if we're together. I don't have all the answers. I don't come here with that. I come here simply with a moral cry to say it's time. It's time to say, as Imam said, that if there is an attack on African Americans, if there's an attack on the poor, if there's an attack on Muslims, if there's an attack on women, if there's an attack on the young people, if there's an attack on the sick, we see it as an attack on our humanity, and we stand up in love and in truth, and we challenge it. And all I know, I'm like y'all. I got the scriptures, and I just believe what the scriptures say. And I just believe that if we come together, is there any imam that'll come stand with me for a moment? One or two of y'all, just let me see if we can paint this picture. I don't know, but I think if we just come together, we come together. We just come together. Rob, you a young Christian preacher, come on up here. If we just come together, if we just find a way to come together, there's some answers we can't be revealed to us till we come together. There's some processes we don't understand till we come together. But if we come together, there's a scripture that I believe even Muslims honor from the Old Testament in the Bible, because you honor those. It's out of Isaiah. And it was a time of despair and a time of captivity and a time of hurt. And the prophet Isaiah was told to tell the people, just stay together, because if you stay together, one day the crooked places will be straightened out. You know that scripture? The crooked places, I thought you would. The crooked places will be straightened out, and the rough places will be made smooth. And the valleys will be exalted, and the mountains will be made low, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. And we will all see it together when we decide forward together, not one step back. We will not be defeated. We will not accept the lies of domination and the myths of destruction. We have been called by all of our holy books, through all of our holy prophets, and through the very Spirit of God, to be the voices of moral dissent in times like this. And if we speak up, others will stand up, and the world shall be changed. Amen.
Great job. Great job. Thank you so much.